Morning. So this is our 5th annual conference, which intends to explore the future energy mix over the next 15 years. Given current trajectories, in 15 years, atmospheric CO2 levels will be probably over 450 parts per million. The last time we saw that was between 5 and 10 million years ago. There was no ice on Greenland. If we continue to procrastinate, by the end of the century, CO2 levels will be at a minimum of 750 parts per million. Last time we saw something like that was 35 to 45 million years ago. There was no ice on Antarctica. CO2 exerts a strong control on climate, and we probably won't lose all that ice in the coming century, but that kind of CO2 levels will have dramatic effects on regional climate, on the water cycle, on disease, stability of ice sheets, and sea level rise. It's almost a promise. And that's fine. In fact, we don't need to worry about it as long as you're not concerned about people and the impact on culture, okay? Now, when I invoke this perspective, some people think it's demoralizing, but it's really not intended to be that way. This sort of information should energize people to take a hard look at the future of energy, because really energy is climate. And our energy use and the type of energy we decide to invest in today will determine the state of Earth's climate tomorrow. Today's fossil fuels provide about 90% of the world's energy, and that's the cause for the rise in atmospheric CO2. Conventional projections still show about 75% of the world's energy driven by fossil fuel in the year 2030, in 15 years from now. But we've all told our parents, or at least I certainly have, that conventional wisdom isn't necessarily always correct. And things could change fast with innovations in technology and new regulatory frameworks. And it's quite possible with what's called disruptive energy technologies like solar power or wind and perhaps more mature conventional type energies like nuclear energy, which is an important mix, and including new energies like fusion, that these kind of systems can be integrated into the world's power systems much further than predicted. Okay, so where do we look towards for conventional wisdom? For 40 years, the large international oil company, Royal Dutch Shell, has committed a significant amount of resources to forecasting the future of energy. And they do this by presenting and evaluating multiple alternative energy scenarios as if each one has an equal chance of occurring as time unfolds. Their work is particularly interesting this week, given that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has released its first report on how to mitigate climate change. Okay, so our first speaker this morning will begin with Niel Golightly of Royal Dutch Shell, who will present the Shell energy scenarios. And this will be followed by 2 panel discussions with distinguished experts from around the world who will speak about topics related to the present state of energy and the future of world energy. And near the end of the conference, we'll hear from Karen Cito. She's a professor of geography here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences on her new IPCC chapter on human settlement, urbanization, and its effect on world energy and global climate. And finally, we'll conclude with a presentation by Nobel laureate and chairman of the IPCC, as well as the founding director of the Yale Climate Energy Institute, Dr. Pachauri, with a perspective on energy and climate impacts. So our first speaker, Niel Golightly, is a vice president of America's Communication of Shell Oil Company in Houston. He was previously based in London, where he led communications and stakeholder engagement for Shell's downstream businesses, including alternative energies. Before joining Shell in 2006, he led sustainable business strategies for Ford Motor Company, where he worked closely with the organization Sustainability to produce auto industry's first report on business implications of climate change. His career has spanned a wide range of roles, from sustainable development and corporate communications to chief of staff for the chairman of Ford, to Pentagon speechwriting, to U.S. naval aviator. Please welcome our first speaker, Niel Golightly.
And you're on.
Great. Thank you very much. It's really a very great pleasure to be here. Mike, at some point I want to understand a little bit more about your relationship with fire, but we'll come back to that a bit later on. Mark really framed the challenge extremely well. It's a challenge that Shell recognizes. It's a challenge that Shell worries about on almost a daily basis. So it's an extraordinary privilege to be here, to be able to share some perspectives and also to perhaps hear what's on your mind and to take a few things back home with me. Yale, the Yale name obviously carries an enormous amount of intellectual mystique. I applaud greatly the work that's done here at the YCEI and Yale broadly. The Yale people that I know think not only very deeply about these kinds of issues and these kinds of challenges, but my experience is that Yale people also think very responsibly about these kinds of challenges as well. And by that I mean not being willing to accept easy conclusions, always being aware and conscious of the systemic consequences of some of the choices and some of the decisions that could be made, and certainly conscious as well of that sort of consilience between the humanities and the sciences and the technology, how people and societies and communities work, and how technology and economic models and businesses work. And that interconnection is one that I think is very important. In the Shell world, we call that the technical and the non-technical side of our business. So it's a fascinating intersection. Thanks, Mark, also for the introduction. It helps, I think, in understanding where I'm coming from, to see how I engage with some of this material. I certainly don't come at this as an expert in science, as an expert in climate, as an expert in economics. Even if I thought I was an expert, I wouldn't try to admit that in this room, certainly. I do come at it, however, from the point of view of what is the role of the corporation in some of these challenges, not only the oil and gas business in a corporation like ours, but corporations more broadly. A lot of the work I've done, both in Ford and in Shell, has been about trying to find that mutual value at the intersection of an institution like mine and the world, the community, the society that our institution serves. And that's a focus of how I certainly engage with this material. Before I go on, I have to say there are no predictions, no future predictions in what I'm about to talk about, but we will be talking about some things in the future that might be considered. This is the SEC's way of saying don't make any investment decisions based on what I'm about to say. So, why scenarios? Shell has been doing scenarios for a little over 40 years or so, and that scenarios work has helped with our business strategists and business decision makers to both anticipate and deal with issues and developments as diverse as the collapse of the Soviet Union, the oil shocks in the 1970s, even the emergence, and especially perhaps the emergence of climate as a major challenge and issue in the 90s. The scenarios are done by a small team inside Royal Dutch Shell, led by a gentleman named Jeremy Bentham. Some of you have met him. I think there is a certain cosmic propinquity in the fact that Jeremy shares a name with the storied philosopher, and it's probably indicative of the quality of work that comes out of that scenarios team, or at least we certainly would like to think so. And the way the scenarios team goes about their work is they identify some of the broad outlines of issues that the company and business like ours might need to meet. And then they engage with a wide number of leading thinkers all over the world in a wide variety of disciplines. And again, some of you in this room have actually engaged with the scenarios team in that process. So hopefully you'll recognize your input in sort of the brief summary I'm about to give you. By the way, I'm not going to try to pretend this is a book tour, but if all of what I'm about to talk about does come out of this very rich publication that we put out last year in conjunction with the New Lens scenarios, and there are copies of it available as you depart. One very, very important point about scenarios: they are not forecasts. It's not a prediction. And the difference between a scenario and a prediction or a forecast, and I'll go ahead and just build this all the way, is really something like this. A forecast, which is something that some of our competitors actually do very well, but a forecast actually starts with a very singular, unified model of what the present is all about. And then it looks at the trajectory of how that model could unfold, and it sort of sets out a very specific prediction of where that's going to take us at some point in the future. And that device certainly has its purposes, and it has a certain amount of value. Scenarios, on the other hand, are much different. Scenarios start with the realization that there are actually a variety of different mental models of where we are currently. And then it looks at the multiple pathways that could evolve from those various mental models in various directions. And some of them will intertwine, some of them will intersect, some of them will diverge, and it creates a range of possible futures that should be considered. And the way I kind of think about it in my very layman's terms, it's a little bit like vacation planning. So if I pack based on a very specific forecast of what the weather is going to be where I'm going, there's a very good chance that that forecast is going to be wrong and I'm going to have the wrong clothes in my suitcase. On the other hand, if I look at a range of scenarios as to what that weather might be where I'm going to have a much better chance of optimizing the selection of clothing I put in my suitcase and have a better chance of having a better vacation. So that's a very simple way of, certainly the way I can understand forecasts and scenarios. Certainly they're important also in the context of our business. The lifetime of energy projects are extremely long, as all of you know, 30, 40, 50 years even. And we need to have a way of thinking about the possible long-term consequences of short-term decisions and vice versa. Finally, I should note that these scenarios are plausible scenarios, necessarily plausible. They start with a certain level of kind of boundary around what we know that we know today, and they explicitly exclude those things that we don't know or that might emerge in the future. So as you'll see later on, there are aspects of these scenarios that aren't particularly encouraging, aren't particularly optimistic, but they don't yet accommodate the possibility that there will be some kind of discontinuous shift, either in the behavior of our markets, in the technology, in policy. So do keep that in mind as we go along. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that we update our scenarios on a regular basis. Every 3, 4, 5 years, we will actually develop a new set of scenarios that accommodate new thinking and new mental models. So our New Lens scenarios, the most current version of our scenarios, are wider ranging than many of the versions that we've done in the past. They go well beyond a simple look at economic models, the supply and demand models, the potential development of policy, and they actually look across the wide spectrum of society at cultural factors, at economic factors, at societal factors, political factors, environmental, and tries to make sense of that entire systemic context in which the energy future plays out. Also, traditionally, scenarios, and some of you have done a lot of work in scenarios, traditionally scenarios come in groups of 3 or 4. We've actually walked away from that a bit. We've settled in the last couple of times that we've done the scenarios on a selection of 2. And the reason for that is what often happens is if you have a selection of 3, there's kind of a range over here on this side of the spectrum and one over here on this side of the spectrum and sort of one in the middle, and the tendency is for people to sort of default to that average or that middle and sort of call that a forecast and work from there. So we've intentionally gone for 2 scenarios the last couple of times, and our newest 2 are called mountains and oceans. It would not be a proper scenario if it didn't have some sort of clever name associated with it. Our last ones were scrambled and blueprints. These are mountains and oceans, and you'll see in a moment why they're called that. But before I get into the mountains and oceans specifically, just a couple of thoughts on words about the landscape underlying them. And first, to start with, a note on pathways. And these this is a concept that gets used often through the New Lens scenarios. And they can be applied to countries, they can be applied to businesses, they can be applied to families, they can probably even be applied to sports teams. But it really is a description of how institutions, organizations sort of work through a period of stress and a period of tension. And they're really kind of two ways: room to maneuver and trapped transition, or trapped in transition. And in that room to maneuver pathway, what the scenarios team sees is that a country, for example, will experience mounting stress, mounting tension around some particular issue. And then there's a sort of a period of drift as we try to comprehend what that tension and what that stress means. What are the options? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? What are the potential solutions? And then eventually there's some early, perhaps mini crisis that actually catalyzes some form of action. And in the room to maneuver pathway, there's enough resilience, there's enough flexibility, there's enough intellectual capacity to actually shift to a new model that addresses that stress, or that addresses that tension. And then the process begins over again until the next tension or the next stress comes along. A fairly healthy, a fairly resilient way of dealing with tensions as they come along. Trapped transition, on the other hand, is something much different. Again, mounting stress around a particular issue, tension, be it climate, economy, Cold War, whatever. A period of drift as people try to come to grips with it. An early crisis which, because there isn't enough resilience, or there isn't enough capacity or economic flexibility in the system, results in a fairly paralyzed reaction, or inadequate ways of addressing that tension, which simply creates sort of a vicious cycle of increasing levels of stress until that mini crisis at the front end becomes an existential crisis, at which point you either fall into complete decay and collapse and it's game over, or to use a business term, you kind of write off the asset and you reset and you start something completely new. Examples in the context of the shell scenarios: room to maneuver. China might be considered a country to be in that kind of room to maneuver space, where they're actively working sort of punctuated reform to address some of the energy challenges in the case of the topic that we're addressing today, or the climate challenges. Trapped in transition. Oh, by the way, I should also mention the cities. Many cities are exhibiting some really exciting, I think, innovative approaches to this sort of room to maneuver pathway. Trapped transition. The EU is probably a good example of an institution that's trapped in transition, where the can keeps getting kicked down the road, inadequate responses to various mini crises, and those crises just keep getting bigger and bigger, with the consequence that there is a significant erosion of political and economic capital as the problems continue to grow. It's probably also important to note a couple of things. One is institutions obviously can move from one to another. I mentioned cities earlier. I was in Detroit 2 weeks ago. We're announcing a big program that we're doing in Detroit in 2015. I spent a lot of years in Detroit when I was in the auto company. I had personally more or less written off Detroit, as I think a lot of people had, as a completely lost cause. And it was clearly a city that was completely trapped in transition, if not already on its way to decay and collapse. What's extraordinary, if any of you have been there lately, is just how much Detroit has been able to turn itself around. Yes, the bankruptcy is in the headlines, but here is a city now that it is finding that sort of reset mode, if you will, kind of moving into now room to maneuver with some incredible city planning that's going on, using it as a source of great innovation. So a good example of how an institution can move from one to the other. And I think it's important also to think, especially in the context of climate and the challenge that Mark laid out just a little bit earlier on, and that most of us think about a lot. is what are the inhibitors to breaking out of a trapped mode, and the gaps between the actual and desired state can often produce as much fear, anxiety, denial, conflict, rather than the kind of courage, the innovation, imagination, and leadership that's required. Also, a lack of social capacity, institutional capacity, economic flexibility, resilience can also prevent moving out of that trapped transition. So earlier I talked about the starting point of mental models of where we are today, and of course scenarios don't start from a blank sheet of paper. They start with something that's actually already happening, and we kind of called out 6 of them here. Probably if we brainstorm in this room we could come up with another 10 or 20, but just briefly a few of these, some of them very self-explanatory. We're obviously in a period of intensified economic cycles. The crisis of 2007 and 8 were only the most prominent examples of that, but also the Euro crisis, the propensity of the U.S. government to engage in fiscal brinksmanship on a regular basis could also fall into that category. Political and social instability, you can probably spin any globe and put your finger on it and find yourself close to some place where there is some level of political and social instability. The Middle East, Thailand, Venezuela, certainly the most recent crisis around Crimea and the Ukraine. As a former Cold Warrior, as a former naval officer, it's fascinating to see some of the dynamics reemerging in that space. Building a minilateral world, this may require a little bit of explanation, is the traditional institutions that engage across national powers, national economies, increasingly fail to accommodate the rise of new powers, of new trends, of new economic powers. The new relationships are beginning to emerge. Those old institutions aren't accommodating nearly the right level of engagement. So you see things like the G20 emerging and other bilateral relationships. The demographic transitions and urbanization, again, probably well known to most of you in this room, the increase of population heading towards 9.5 billion people at the middle of the century, and the creation, on average, of a city of 1 million people every week for the next 30 years is certainly a trend that needs to be accommodated. I would hasten to say, by the way, we kind of think of that almost automatically many times as sort of this dystopic kind of challenge. In fact, I think a lot of innovators are looking at that as a huge opportunity to be much more efficient in the way that we meet society's needs. But it's not just the size of the population, but populations becoming radically younger in some cases, some populations becoming radically older, generational, educational, and economic expectations changing, lifestyle expectations changing from one generation to the next, and all those fall into that dynamic. Challenged environmental boundaries. Climate is obviously the most prominent, and yet it is a part of what at Shell we've called the stress nexus. We're not the only ones who call it that. But it's this linkage between water, energy, and food, with biodiversity and climate being kind of the package that it all falls into. And, of course, that stress nexus spreads across national boundaries, political boundaries, certainly across corporate boundaries in a way that makes the collaboration and the engagement on some of these challenges even more important. And then all of that sort of kind of drives emerging resources across the entire spectrum. So traditional resources, whether it's hydrocarbons in deep water or in the Arctic, all the way through to gas and shale gas and the revolution that we've seen in this country, all the way through to the emergence and the rapid growth in solar, wind, and at some point hydrogen as well. I have a particular interest in how the dilemmas of energy and climate change land with the billions of people out there for whom these kinds of issues are either seemingly remote or in some cases impenetrable or in other cases seemingly insoluble. And I look at that in the context of the 2 billion people or so in the world who live on less than $2 a day, have no access to any energy outside of biomass whatsoever. There's another 3 billion or so who live on something less than $40 a day, and that's maybe enough to pay for kind of basic electricity. There's another billion that lives on less than $80 a day, and that's enough to run a washing machine, possibly. And then there's that billion that have that first world lifestyle, perhaps best defined as the ability to get on an airplane and fly someplace for a holiday. And certainly different societies have very, very different needs and very different priorities, which of course raises the urgent question, who gets to decide which of those priorities and which of those needs and which of those priorities are the most critical. And when we look at some of the data around the widening gap between the rich and the poor, the wealthy and those who are in poverty, you begin to think about some of the bottom-up drivers of the policies and the solutions that we may all be considering, which in some cases, when you think about consumer behavior, when you think about the needs of the broader population, can be as important as some of the top-down ideas and policies that we may consider. In fact, I think one of the things that we're seeing already and will play themselves out in the scenarios is a new Gilded Age in many respects, with a widening gap between not just wealth but also opportunity, education, skills, and where this could be taking us in some respects is that the attraction of liberal democratic systems are under pressure, and even in liberal democratic nations. So, mountains, the first of our two scenarios. This is mountains it posits a relatively static world. The broad outlines of power in the world remain recognizable over the decades. Change, when it does happen, tends to be from the top by an elite that really needs to seek to preserve the status quo. It does call to mind the Italian novelist Giuseppe Lampedusa, who wrote, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." And that's kind of what change looks like in a mountains world. The core pattern that you'll recognize here is how advantage drives more advantage. So that gap, that Gilded Age, becomes even more exacerbated. Influence typically remains concentrated in the hands of people who are already powerful and already influential. And those few who do manage to rise through that gap typically do so in this mountains world. They typically do so through traditional channels, whether it be sports, whether it be business, whether it be popular culture, and that simply reinforces the prevailing ideology. And the rigidity of this mountains world hampers collective decision-making, and it actually slows down broad-based economic growth. At the same time, however, and somewhat ironically, with fewer power brokers intent on protecting the status quo, established bilateral relationships, some progress is possible through what we call secondary policies, where interests align. An example might be authorities who might be fearful of the kind of social stresses that might arise in a large urban center where resources are under stress, opportunity is under stress, transport is under stress, might find their interests aligning with urban developers to actually look at much more efficient, much more compact cities with very efficient, more sustainable infrastructures. So you see some secondary policies that emerge. Same thing actually on the supply side in energy. With that very static, very centralized kind of top-down policy-making framework, you might see the possibility of things like gas emerging much more quickly in an accelerated fashion as the policy framework required to allow for development of shale gas and other resources is pushed through. Same thing with things like carbon capture and storage, which does, even today, require a great deal of concerted policy support. In energy terms, the slower pace of economic development delays or relaxes the pricing pressures, and that means that with a smaller number of influential power brokers, that enables a more coherent and policy-driven investments in infrastructure, in transport systems, and as I said earlier, in cities. Governments are freer to impose regulatory restrictions on things like road transports, tailpipe emissions, efficiency standards, fuel taxes, and so on. You see countries like China might be an example with its political system able to drive even more aggressive policies around some of the pressures that they're seeing, both on the energy side and on the climate side. So a big push into gas as a potential long-term alternative to coal. And I was just learning last night about some of the projects that China has begun in the nuclear power field as well. For those of you who like bar charts, just a kind of a summary of what that could look like in a mountains world, primary energy by source. And really the summary here is that with a sluggish economic growth and low demand as a consequence for energy, you see a very moderated sort of price environment, which in some ways means good things, but in other ways that minimizes the incentive to unlock new sources of energy, new innovations, especially in the renewable side. So you do see here a flattening of oil and liquid fuels, because as that transport infrastructure becomes less dependent on liquid fuels, it becomes more electrified in compact cities where policy has created a much more efficient infrastructure. The demand for oil tends to taper off. Gas becomes the backbone. The top-down policy frameworks that allow for the unlocking of that gas resource does accelerate the production of gas, and that actually has a beneficial effect on CO2. You see coal more or less hold its own. It actually comes back again later in the century, but that's coal with CCS. And you see a modest increase, or relatively modest increase in the renewables and in the solar in this mountains world. Compare that then to oceans. Oceans is a much more volatile, much more bottoms-up world of empowered populations driving structural reforms, much more economic activity, much more economic growth. The participation in leadership tends to extend beyond the traditional power base. There is an unrelenting distrust in governments and in big business and big business institutions, which means that a lot of innovation, a lot of economic activity actually emerges from other dimensions. Power, money, knowledge, all of those ebb and flow in a much more spontaneous fashion than they do in mountains. And the TINA, there is no alternative world of where the U.S. free market liberal democratic proposition, that liberal democratic model, that world is increasingly challenged by a Terra world. There are real alternatives in which countries like China and others are able to exert the kind of soft power that was always traditionally the domain of the U.S., at least in recent history. And the challenge to traditional power increases the number of those mini-lateral relationships that I talked about a little bit earlier, with sort of this patchwork globalism that nourishes competing ideologies and competing ideas. Rules in an oceans world are very difficult to enforce globally, even harder to agree on, and a growing social media interconnectedness. Yes, it does drive the spread of information and the spread of ideas, but at the same time, it also creates a much more volatile world of balkanized opinion, where anybody, anywhere can find somebody to support the view that they may intuitively hold. And reforms in this world unleash new productivity and growth, but they also serve to increase the appetite for more of the same. And in consumer terms, that means more cars, it means more white goods, it means more air conditioning, it means more of those holidays on airplanes. So as you will see, this is a world in which the CO2 climate stresses become even more acute. Oceans in energy terms. It's a world of tight energy supply and demand tension and rising commodity prices. And fast emerging economies, along with an increasing population, drive a much higher demand curve. And that rising price drives certainly more efficiency technologies, but it also serves to unlock more expensive and more ubiquitous sources of energy. Again, like deep water, Arctic, and in many countries, a continuing dependency on coal. Liquid fuel and coal continue to play a leading role in this oceans world in the energy mix, and they're only displaced somewhere around the 2060, 2070 timeframe by solar, when the impacts of climate become so acute that an urgent and abrupt transition needs to take place. In an oceans world, natural gas does grow its share, but it undershoots expectations because of that lack of a top-down supporting policy framework. And again, just to summarize, here we see that supply and demand tension increasing. That results in a higher price environment in energy. It results also in a long liquids game, and finally a much later but much more abrupt transition to solar. Just to summarize those two things side by side, and to take a quick look back at history, obviously in both oceans and mountains, we can't rewrite history, contrary to some opinions, but biomass before the Industrial Revolution, transitioning to coal, transitioning to oil, and now as we see what the future could look like in these two scenarios, we see a mountains world much more dependent on a natural gas backbone, and we see a oceans world more dependent longer on a coal-oil mix with a sudden transition to solar out in the back half of the century. To look at a couple of implications here before I ramp up. So what does all this potentially mean? And again, there's a lot more in the book if you're interested in looking at it in more detail. But here we see, at least in the oceans context, and it's not all that different in the mountains context, that difference between OECD energy curves and non-OECD energy curves. And the main point that I want to make here is that a lot of what drives the energy mix in the developed world, even though it's a relatively flat demand curve, what drives that mix is the pressure on the non-OECD, the developing world side. So that price pressure, that demand pressure, drives that lower oil demand in the mix on the developed world, and a more rapid take-up of renewables in the developed side of the equation. Here, looking at an intra-national look, mountains and oceans in the context of just the United States. Here, ironically, even though in mountains there's a more sluggish growth, you see a slightly higher demand curve, and that's again a result of that influence of the developing world and the demand and the pricing tensions there. This one is of particular interest, well, to me as a former Ford guy, but also in the context of Shell. I think in many respects, Shell might be able to consider itself as much a mobility company as it is an energy company, because a great deal of the energy that we produce actually finds its way in some way, shape, or form into transport, whether it be fuels, whether it be in lubricants, whether it actually even be in the plastics that go into the construction of vehicles. So we have a keen interest in what happens in the transport world and ways that we can anticipate where that market is going. And here you see two very, very different pictures of how transport could develop under these two different scenarios. And in the mountains world, once again, because of that predominance of top-down policy, you see a much more efficient transport infrastructure, one that transitions to electricity much more rapidly, and eventually into hydrogen in a significant and material fashion, because hydrogen will depend a great deal on the policy frameworks that allow for that collaboration with producers and consumers and businesses. On the ocean side, on the other hand, because of that sort of pell-mell economic growth and more interest in the economic growth and in transitioning to different models, you see a longer dependence on liquid fuels. Okay. The link between energy and water, again, talking a lot about climate, but the significance of the water role in energy is not to be underestimated. I have heard our own CEO on occasion say it's possible that water may be an even more urgent issue for a company like Shell even than climate in some respects, because they're so interconnected. And here you see the stresses that are associated with coal in the mountains, but in oceans, that transition to solar is going to come with its own set of water stresses. And here we start to get to the nub of what this conference is about, the CO2 contrast by emissions point source. And again, in this context, you see mountains is not necessarily an attractive world, but it does offer a quicker path to lower emissions. Not attractive in the sense of economic growth, not attractive necessarily even in the sense of kind of cultural dynamics, but it is a quicker path to lower emissions on the CO2 side. And that's a result of that slower economic development and more government support for the infrastructure required to reduce CO2, like nuclear, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and compact cities. Oceans gets close to zero by the end of the century, but the time it takes to get to zero is much longer, and the curve is much greater. And here is a curve a picture that will look familiar to you, and this is where the unpleasant punchline comes in, at least in terms of kind of the current plausible scenarios. The dotted line being, of course, the 2-degree pathway, oceans being the blue line at the top, and mountains being that line in the middle. The question then becomes, in my mind, not just what decisions we might make based on what is plausible against these scenarios, but what are the implausible things that we should be looking at? What are the implausible things that should be considered that could close this gap? And what are the implausible things that should happen to make this happen? We do look at a range of what we know. I talked earlier about that plausibility. There are, as I watched the Twitterverse light up after the IPCC report this past weekend, it's fascinating to see the range of views that suggest that actually all of this is impossible and we're toast and there's absolutely nothing that we can do about it at one end of the spectrum. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are those that say, well, this is easy stuff to do, and we could get on with it if just a few bad guys would get out of the way. Probably neither is correct, but there are some breakthroughs, some changes, some transitions, some discontinuous shifts that are likely to be necessary in order to tackle this conundrum. And there are some sources of optimism, in my view. One of them emerges from this chart, which looks at the pace of efficiency improvement over the last 50 years or so. So just a couple of examples here in terms of the energy required to make a ton of steel, which is enough to build one car. 24 gigajoules back in 1960, down to 13 gigajoules now. No reason in the world why it might not be down to 6 in 2060. And you see a similar pattern for vehicle miles traveled, the energy required for a household appliance, and even lighting your room. So major transitions are possible. And finally, just a few takeaways that I offer for consideration. And these are my words; these aren't Jeremy's. Although I don't think he'd disagree with any of them. The dilemmas in this that emerge from the scenarios, they're long, they're wide, and they're deep. They're long term, very, very long term. They cross a number of different sectors, a number of different disciplines, a number of different cultures and societies, and they're very deep in the sense of they get to the core not only of how our businesses run, but how our communities run, how our governments run, and how perhaps in many respects we as individuals lead our lives. They are existential, not just political, so it's easy to kind of shift some of these debates into belief systems that are based on political assumptions or political beliefs. And in fact, and again, I think Mark said it very eloquently at the beginning of the day, these are really about the existence of ourselves and certainly future generations. Intentional choices require conscious trade-offs. The scenarios give us a tool to see some of those choices and some of those trade-offs. And what they tell us very clearly, and what hopefully is obvious to certainly everybody in this room, is there are no necessarily easy answers, but the intelligence required to select amongst competing goods and bads is necessary, and it's not just a matter of finding the right or the wrong answer. It really is a matter of trade-offs. A plausible path to 2 degrees will be very, very hard. But again, I'm an optimist. It is not impossible, and it's not impossible mainly because there are some really, really bright people working on the problem. But I should also say that what we might be able to do tomorrow should not condemn what we can do today. And we need to avoid getting trapped in that transition where nothing happens because everything seems to be a bad choice. So, for example, just to put in a little bit of a plug for some of the things that Shell is working on, we have, for example, a $40 per ton cost of carbon that we apply to every single project that we do inside the company. So we've already looked at the scenarios and said, yes, this is something that we're going to have to deal with and that we have to deal with today. And one way to do that is to make sure that even if the external market doesn't put a cost on carbon that is appropriate, we'll put a cost of carbon on ourselves. And we'll run every project on all the economics and all the technology of those projects through that filter. The work that we're doing on carbon capture and storage, I think one of the things that's starting to emerge from the IPCC report and others is that CCS is going to be absolutely essential to any kind of solution that we arrive at in the future. We have a project in Canada. The significance of that is that it's about a $1.3 billion project. The Canadian state and federal government has contributed a significant chunk of that, but about a third of that cost falls on us. There will be no return to Shell on the cost of that carbon capture and storage project. There will be no return. So this is an investment in understanding how this will work. It's an investment in proving out the concept. It's an investment in encouraging other governments and companies to accelerate the CCS technology and the policies associated with it. And certainly some of the work that's being done in biofuels. We have a $12 billion JV in Brazil around sugarcane biofuels, sugarcane, of course, being currently the most sustainable of the biofuels options out there. And then finally, we are bees as well as chimps. And here, as a dilettante in the liberal arts, I'm struck by some of the works that I've read by E.O. Wilson, who talks about human evolution and the fact that the Homo sapiens being sort of a eusocial species that is activated by the survival of the species as much as it is by the survival of the individual. And I think if you look back, again, as a liberal arts dilettante, if you look back over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years of human history, there is a case for optimism where human society does find ways to tackle those challenges, to get out of that trap transition, and to create for itself room to maneuver. I hope some of this gives you some food for thought and some useful context for the discussions that you're going to be having for the rest of the day. It's just such a privilege to have the opportunity to share some of this with you, and I thank you very much for your attention.